In the summer and early autumn of 1941, the German Wehrmacht surged across the vast plains of the Soviet Union, their tanks and infantry slicing through Soviet defenses with a speed and ferocity that seemed unstoppable. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand plan to crush the Red Army and claim the Soviet heartland, had begun with stunning success. Cities fell, armies crumbled, and the German soldiers, flush with victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, carried a swagger born of invincibility. They were the masters of blitzkrieg, their war machine honed to perfection, their confidence unshaken by the sprawling landscape before them. As they pushed deeper into Russia, capturing prisoners and seizing equipment, they encountered the thick, heavy winter gear of the Soviet troops, bulky coats, fur-lined hats, and padded boots, and laughed. To these battle-hardened men, the gear was a joke, a sign of Soviet backwardness, unnecessary in a war they believed would be over before the first snow fell. The Russian winter, they scoffed, was no match for their might, and the idea of needing such clumsy clothing was absurd to an army convinced of its own supremacy. The German soldiers, basking in the warmth of late summer, saw the Soviet winter gear as a symbol of their enemy's inferiority. They rifled through supply depots, holding up quilted jackets and oversized ushankas, their laughter echoing through the dusty air. "Look at this," a young infantryman crowed, draping a heavy Soviet coat over his shoulders, its bulk dwarfing his frame. "They dress like bears. Do they think we'll stay long enough for winter?" His comrades roared with amusement, tossing fur hats back and forth like toys, their voices thick with disdain. The gear seemed primitive compared to their own sleek uniforms, field gray tunics and polished boots designed for the rapid campaigns of Western Europe. To them, the Soviets were a ragtag force, ill-equipped and poorly led, their reliance on such cumbersome clothing proof of their unpreparedness for modern warfare. This mockery was rooted in more than just arrogance. It was fueled by a belief in the invincibility of their strategy. The Germans had conquered nations in weeks, their panzer divisions rolling through France and the Low Countries with a speed that left their enemies reeling. They expected the Soviet Union to fall just as quickly, its vast distances no match for their mechanized might. The Russian winter, mentioned in passing by some officers, was dismissed as a minor inconvenience. "We'll be in Moscow by Christmas," a panzer crewman boasted, wiping sweat from his brow as he repaired his tank in the September heat. "The Reds will surrender before the snow fell." His words reflected a broader sentiment among the troops. The Soviet Union was a house of cards, its people weak, its army outdated, and its climate irrelevant to a war that would end in German triumph. The soldiers' confidence was bolstered by their early successes. By October 1941, they had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing millions of Soviet prisoners and vast swaths of territory. They saw the Red Army's retreats as proof of their own superiority, and the captured winter gear only deepened their contempt. A group of artillerymen, sorting through a pile of Soviet equipment near Smolensk, mocked the padded boots they found, so different from their own leather ones. "These are for peasants trudging through snow," one said, kicking a boot aside. "We'll be sipping vodka in the Kremlin while they freeze." The laughter spread, a release of tension after weeks of grueling marches, but also a reflection of their certainty that the war would be swift. The idea of needing heavy coats or fur hats was absurd to men who believed they'd dictate the terms of victory long before winter set in. Nazi propaganda reinforced this hubris. The German troops had been fed a steady diet of stories about the Soviet Union's weakness, its backward economy, its disorganized military, its people cowed by Stalin's regime. The Red Army's soldiers, they were told, were poorly trained, their equipment inferior, their spirit broken. The winter gear, with its rough stitching and utilitarian design, seemed to confirm these narratives. "They're not soldiers, they're farmers," a young lieutenant sneered, inspecting a Soviet greatcoat with disdain. They think they can hide in their furs and outlast us. They don't know who they're fighting." His men nodded, their faith in their own technology, sleek tanks, precision rifles, and fast-moving trucks, unshaken by the thought of colder days ahead. The Germans' dismissal of the winter gear was a rejection of the environment itself. They had fought in the temperate climates of Western Europe, where campaigns were decided in weeks, not seasons. The vastness of Russia, with its endless steppes and looming forests, was new to them, but they saw it as a challenge their blitzkrieg could overcome. The Russian winter, mentioned in history books about Napoleon's failed invasion, was a distant cautionary tale, not a present concern. Officers briefed their troops on logistics and battle plans, rarely mentioning the weather beyond assurances that the campaign would conclude before it mattered. A supply sergeant, tasked with distributing blankets to his unit, laughed off a subordinate's question about winter clothing. He said, "We won't need it," gesturing to the clear autumn sky. "The Führer has planned for everything." Yet beneath the bravado, there were flickers of unease, quickly dismissed but present nonetheless. Some soldiers, particularly those who had studied history or spoken with veterans of earlier campaigns, wondered about the stories of Russia's brutal winters. They'd heard tales of temperatures plunging far below freezing, of snowdrifts swallowing roads, and frostbite claiming fingers and toes. But these concerns were brushed aside, drowned out by the momentum of their advance and the promise of a quick victory. A machine gunner, cleaning his weapon in a captured Soviet village, overheard a local woman mutter about the coming cold. "Let it come," he said defiantly, his breath visible in the crisp October air. "It won't stop us." His words, echoed by thousands of others, reflected a collective refusal to take the Soviet winter seriously, a belief that their skill, their technology, and their will would conquer all. This mockery, so confident and so widespread, was a dangerous blind spot. The German soldiers, caught up in their early triumphs, failed to see the warning signs in the heavy Soviet gear they ridiculed. They didn't notice the practicality of the quilted jackets, designed to insulate against sub-zero temperatures, or the fur hats, crafted to shield against biting winds. They didn't consider the padded boots, built to keep feet warm in snowdrifts that could bury a man. Their laughter was a shield against doubt, a way to dismiss an enemy they underestimated and an environment they didn't understand. But as the days grew shorter and the air turned colder, the Russian winter loomed, silent and unforgiving, ready to reveal a truth the Germans had mocked. No army, no matter how mighty, could conquer the elements without preparation. The gear they laughed at would soon become a lifeline they lacked, and the consequences would be deadly.
By November 1941, the German soldiers pushing toward Moscow on the Eastern Front were beginning to feel a chill that went beyond the cooling autumn air. The Wehrmacht, so confident in the summer months, had swept across the Soviet Union with a speed that seemed to promise victory by year's end. They had laughed at the heavy, quilted coats and fur-lined hats of captured Soviet troops, dismissing them as relics of a backward army, unnecessary for a blitzkrieg that would end before winter's bite. But as the days shortened and the skies darkened, the Russian winter descended with a ferocity that no amount of bravado could repel. Temperatures plummeted, snowstorms buried roads, and the German army, clad in thin uniforms designed for milder climates, found itself cruelly exposed. The gear they had mocked became a bitter reminder of their unpreparedness, and the elements, relentless and unforgiving, began to exact a toll that would shake their confidence to its core. The first signs of trouble came as the temperatures dropped below freezing, a cold unlike anything most of the soldiers had ever known. The German troops, equipped with field-gray tunics and leather boots suited for the temperate fields of France or Poland, shivered in their trenches and foxholes. Their greatcoats, meant for autumn rains, offered little protection against the biting wind that swept across the Russian steppes. A young infantryman, huddled near a smoldering fire outside Smolensk, wrapped his scarf tighter around his face, his fingers already numb through his thin gloves. "This isn't cold," he muttered, echoing the bravado of his comrades. "It's just weather." But his words were hollow, and the chattering of his teeth betrayed the truth. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was a force, a relentless enemy that seeped into their bones and sapped their strength. As November gave way to December, the snowstorms arrived, transforming the landscape into a frozen nightmare. Blizzards howled across the open plains, piling snow into drifts that swallowed roads and stalled the German advance. Tanks and trucks, the backbone of the Blitzkrieg, bogged down in the deep snow, their engines seizing in the sub-zero temperatures. A panzer crewman, his hands raw from trying to free his tank's tracks from a frozen rut, cursed under his breath as he realized their motor oil had turned to sludge. "We were told Moscow was ours," he growled to his commander, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But this snow, it's fighting for the Reds." The Soviet winter gear they had mocked now seemed like a cruel taunt, a lifeline they lacked as the temperature plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius and below. The soldiers' uniforms, once a source of pride, became a liability. Their leather boots, polished to a shine in the summer, soaked up the snow and froze, leaving feet vulnerable to frostbite. A machine gunner, limping back from a patrol, peeled off his boots to find his toes blackened and swollen, the pain so intense he could barely stand. "No one told us it would be like this," he said, his voice shaking as a medic wrapped his feet in inadequate bandages. The Wehrmacht's standard-issue gloves, thin and meant for quick campaigns, offered no protection against the cold that turned metal weapons into skin-searing traps. Soldiers wrapped their hands in rags or scavenged cloth, desperate to keep their fingers from freezing to their rifles. The heavy Soviet coats they had laughed at, designed to insulate against this very cold, were now objects of envy, spotted on Red Army prisoners who seemed to move with an ease the Germans couldn't match. The logistical failures compounded their misery. The German supply lines, stretched thin across hundreds of miles, struggled to deliver even basic necessities. Winter clothing, promised by commanders who had underestimated the campaign's duration, arrived sporadically, or not at all. A supply officer in a forward position near Moscow opened a crate expecting coats, only to find summer uniforms and propaganda leaflets. "What good is this?" he shouted, hurling a bundle of papers into the snow. The soldiers, left to fend for themselves, scavenged what they could: blankets from abandoned villages, shawls from dead civilians, even the occasional Soviet greatcoat stripped from a fallen enemy. But these were stopgaps, insufficient against a winter that seemed to grow colder with every passing day. A sergeant, wrapping his feet in torn burlap, muttered bitterly, "We laughed at their boots. Now I'd give my soul for a pair." The snowstorms were relentless, turning routine tasks into grueling ordeals. Marching became a battle against knee-deep drifts, each step sapping energy from men already weakened by hunger and cold. Sentry duty was torture. Soldiers stood for hours in the open, their breath freezing on their scarves, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. A young private, posted on a windswept ridge, felt his eyelids grow heavy as the cold dulled his senses. "Stay awake," his officer barked, shaking him, but his hands were already blue, his rifle too cold to touch. The storms blinded them, obscuring landmarks and making navigation almost impossible. Units lost contact with each other, their radios failing in the extreme conditions. A reconnaissance patrol, caught in a blizzard, wandered for hours, only to stumble back to camp with 2 men missing, claimed by the snow they had once dismissed as a minor obstacle. The physical toll was matched by a growing psychological strain. The German soldiers, who had marched into Russia with visions of a quick victory, now faced an enemy they couldn't fight with bullets or tanks: the winter itself. Their earlier mockery of the Soviet gear haunted them as they realized its purpose. The Red Army, equipped with clothing designed for these conditions, seemed to thrive where the Germans faltered. Red Army troops moved through the snow with purpose, their quilted jackets and fur hats shielding them from the cold that crippled their enemies. A German officer, watching a group of Soviet prisoners march past, noted their resilience with a mix of envy and despair. He wrote in his diary, "They're built for this. We thought we were invincible, but this land is their ally." The consequences of their unpreparedness were becoming deadly. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed more men than Soviet bullets in some units. Field hospitals, overwhelmed and undersupplied, filled with soldiers suffering from frozen limbs, their screams echoing as medics amputated blackened fingers and toes. A medic, his hands shaking from cold and exhaustion, bandaged a soldier's frostbitten feet, knowing the man would likely never walk again. "We didn't prepare for this," he said quietly, his eyes hollow. Disease spread in the weakened ranks, pneumonia, dysentery, infections exacerbated by the cold. Food, already scarce, became harder to distribute as supply trucks stalled in snowdrifts. The soldiers, hungry and freezing, began to lose the fire that had driven them through the summer. "We were supposed to be in Moscow," a corporal whispered, staring at the snow piling up outside his tent. "Now we're just trying to survive." The winter exposed not just the soldiers' physical vulnerabilities, but the flaws in their entire campaign. The German High Command, so certain of a swift victory, had failed to plan for a prolonged war in Russia's harshest season. The Blitzkrieg, built for speed and decisiveness, was grinding to a halt, its momentum buried under snow and ice. The soldiers, who had laughed at the Soviet winter gear as a sign of weakness, now saw their own lack of preparation as a fatal miscalculation. The cold was relentless, the storms unending, and the Russian winter was proving to be a foe they couldn't outrun nor outfight. As they huddled in their inadequate shelters, their breath visible in the frigid air, the memory of their earlier mockery lingered, a bitter reminder of the hubris that had left them exposed to a merciless enemy they could not conquer.
By December 1941, the German soldiers on the Eastern Front were no longer laughing at the thick, heavy Soviet winter gear they had once mocked. The Russian winter, which they had dismissed as a minor inconvenience, had become a merciless adversary. Its freezing temperatures and relentless snowstorms exposing the Wehrmacht's hubris in a way no enemy could have planned. The men who had marched into the Soviet Union with visions of a swift victory now faced a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Frostbite gnawed at their hands and feet, exhaustion drained their will to fight, and battlefield losses mounted as the Red Army, hardened by the winter and equipped for its rigors, struck back with devastating force. The thin uniforms and inadequate supplies that had seemed sufficient in the summer now betrayed the Germans, leaving them vulnerable to the elements and the resurgent Soviets. The winter, once a joke, was now a killer, and the toll it exacted would mark a turning point in the war, shattering the myth of German invincibility. The cold was a relentless enemy, unlike anything the German soldiers had faced in their earlier campaigns. Temperatures plunged to -40°C, a bone-chilling cold that turned breath into ice and made every moment outside a battle for survival. The Wehrmacht's standard-issue greatcoats and leather boots, designed for the milder climates of Western Europe, were woefully inadequate. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags or stuffed their boots with straw, desperate to ward off the frostbite that crept in with every gust of wind. A young infantryman, stationed in a makeshift trench outside Moscow, watched his fingers turn white and numb, the skin cracking as he tried to grip his rifle. "It's like holding fire," he whispered to a comrade, his voice trembling as he realized the cold was stealing his body bit by bit. Frostbite was no longer a distant threat, but a daily reality, claiming toes, fingers, and noses, leaving men maimed before a shot was fired. The field hospitals, already strained by the demands of war, became scenes of horror. Medics, working in tents that offered little protection from the cold, were overwhelmed by the flood of frostbite cases. Soldiers hobbled in, their faces pale, their hands or feet blackened by the cold's cruel grip. And amputations became routine, the sound of saws cutting through frozen flesh mingling with the screams of men who could no longer feel their limbs. A medic, his hands shaking from exhaustion, wrapped a soldier's stump where a foot had been, muttering, "We can't keep up. There are too many." The hospitals lacked proper bandages, anesthetics, and even heat, forcing medics to operate in conditions as brutal as the front lines. For every man treated, dozens more waited, their injuries worsening as the cold continued its relentless assault. Exhaustion compounded the physical toll, sapping the strength of an army already stretched to its limits. The German soldiers, who had marched hundreds of miles since June, were now fighting to survive as much as to advance. The deep snowdrifts made every movement a struggle. Patrols slogged through waist-high snow, their legs burning with effort, while supply convoys stalled, leaving units without food or ammunition. Sleep was a luxury, stolen in brief moments between blizzards or Soviet attacks. A machine gunner, slumped in a foxhole, hadn't slept in days, his eyes red from fatigue and cold. "I can't feel my body anymore," he said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. But closing his eyes risked death, either from the cold or the enemy, and so he pressed on, driven by a fading instinct to survive. The battlefield losses were catastrophic, driven not just by the winter, but by the Red Army's resurgence. The Soviets, equipped with their heavy winter gear, quilted jackets, fur hats, and padded boots, moved with a purpose the Germans couldn't match. They launched counteroffensives, exploiting the Wehrmacht's weakened state. The Battle of Moscow, raging through December 1941 and into January 1942, became a turning point. Soviet divisions, led by generals like Zhukov, struck at German lines with ferocity, their T-34 tanks and ski troops slicing through the snow where German panzers faltered. A German corporal, watching a Soviet assault overrun his position, saw Red Army soldiers in thick coats, their faces barely visible under fur hats, moving as if the winter was an ally. "They're ghosts," he muttered, his rifle useless as his frozen fingers fumbled with the trigger. His unit, decimated by cold and combat, retreated in disarray, leaving behind equipment and comrades in the snow. The Germans' lack of winter gear, once a source of mockery, was now a deadly liability. The Soviet troops, wrapped in the very clothing the Germans had laughed at, could operate in conditions that crippled their enemies. Their boots kept their feet warm, their coats shielded them from the wind, and their hats protected against frostbite, advantages the Germans lacked. A panzer officer, his unit stranded when their tanks froze, envied the Soviet soldiers he saw across the lines. He wrote in a letter, his handwriting shaky from cold, "They move like they were born in this snow. We're dying out here, and they're fighting." The German supply chain, overstretched and underprepared, failed to deliver the winter clothing promised by commanders. Makeshift solutions, scavenged blankets, stolen Soviet coats, or layers of newspaper stuffed into boots, were no match for the sub-zero temperatures. The soldiers, once proud of their sleek uniforms, now looked like ragged beggars, their morale crumbling as their bodies failed. The human cost was staggering. By January 1942, the German army had lost tens of thousands to frostbite, disease, and hypothermia, with estimates suggesting over 100,000 cases of cold-related injuries on the Eastern Front that winter. Entire units were rendered combat ineffective, their ranks thinned by men too sick or maimed to fight. A company commander, reporting to his superiors, described his unit as a shadow of itself, with half his men hospitalized or dead from the cold. The battlefield losses were equally dire.
Soviet counterattacks pushed the Germans back from Moscow, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing thousands of prisoners. The Wehrmacht, which had planned to celebrate Christmas in the Kremlin, was instead fighting a desperate retreat, their dreams of victory buried under snow and blood. The psychological impact was profound. The soldiers, who had mocked the Soviet winter gear as a sign of weakness, now saw their own arrogance as a fatal flaw. The cold was not just a physical enemy, but a mirror reflecting their overconfidence and the failure of their leaders to prepare for Russia's reality. A young private, wrapping his frostbite hands in rags, stared into a dying campfire and whispered, "We thought we were unstoppable, but this winter, it's killing us." His words echoed across the front, marked a shift in the German mindset. The myth of invincibility, so carefully cultivated by victories in the West, was unraveling. The soldiers began to fear not just the Soviets, but the land itself, a vast, frozen expanse that seemed to conspire against them. The catastrophe of that winter was a turning point, not just for the soldiers, but for the entire German campaign. The Wehrmacht's advance stalled, its momentum broken by the cold and the Red Army's fierce resistance. The men who survived would carry the scars, physical and mental, of their ordeal, their earlier laughter replaced by a grim recognition of their vulnerability. The Soviet winter gear, once a joke, had proven its worth, while the Germans' lack of preparation had cost them dearly. As they huddled in their frozen trenches, the snow piling up around them, the soldiers faced a truth they could no longer deny. The Russian winter was not a minor obstacle, but a deadly force, and their mockery had invited its wrath.
By January 1942, the German soldiers on the Eastern Front were no longer the confident conquerors who had mocked the heavy Soviet winter gear months earlier. The Russian winter, which they had dismissed as a trivial obstacle, had become a relentless executioner, its freezing temperatures and blinding snowstorms stripping away their strength, their morale, and their hope. The Wehrmacht's advance on Moscow had crumbled under the weight of the cold and the Red Army's ferocious counteroffensives, forcing a chaotic retreat that left the Germans fighting not just for victory, but for survival. Supply shortages turned their once mighty war machine into a ragged band of scavengers, their thin uniforms no match for the sub-zero temperatures that claimed limbs and lives. In their desperation to endure, they resorted to extreme measures, stealing clothing from the dead, burning villages for warmth, and abandoning comrades in the snow, revealing the depths of their plight and the catastrophic cost of their earlier arrogance. The cold was a constant torment, a force that seemed to conspire with the Soviets to break the German army. Temperatures hovered between -30 and -40 degrees Celsius, turning the landscape into a frozen wasteland where every step was a battle. The soldiers' uniforms, designed for quick campaigns in milder climates, were pitifully inadequate. Their greatcoats, soaked by snow and stiffened by ice, offered little warmth, while their leather boots cracked and split, leaving feet vulnerable to frostbite. A young rifleman, his fingers blackened from the cold, wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from a dead comrade's shirt, his hands shaking as he tried to load his rifle. "We're not soldiers anymore," he muttered to a fellow infantryman, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We're just trying to live." The Soviet winter gear they had once laughed at, thick quilted jackets, fur-lined hats, and padded boots, now haunted them, a reminder of the preparation they lacked as they faced a winter that showed no mercy. Supply shortages pushed the Germans to the edge of collapse. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, stretched across hundreds of miles of snow-covered terrain, had buckled under the strain of the winter. Trucks, vital for delivering food, fuel, and clothing, were immobilized by frozen engines or buried in snowdrifts. A supply officer, tasked with feeding a battalion near Vyazma, stared at an empty crate that should have held winter coats, his face etched with despair. "They promised us supplies," he said, kicking the crate into the snow. "All we got was paper and lies." The soldiers, already weakened by hunger, were reduced to eating frozen potatoes scavenged from abandoned villages, or the occasional horse that collapsed under the cold. Rations, when they arrived, were pitiful, moldy bread or thin soup that froze in the tin before it could be eaten. The men, gaunt and shivering, began to resemble the Soviet prisoners they had once mocked, their pride replaced by a primal need to survive. Desperation drove the soldiers to measures they could scarcely have imagined months earlier. They scavenged whatever they could to ward off the cold: blankets from ruined houses, shawls from civilian corpses, even straw stuffed into their clothing for insulation. Some, in acts of grim necessity, stripped Soviet dead of their winter gear, pulling on the heavy coats and fur hats they had once ridiculed. A panzer crewman, his own coat tattered, donned a Soviet greatcoat taken from a fallen soldier, its warmth a bitter reminder of his own army's failure. "It smells of death," he whispered to his comrade, "but it's better than freezing." Others burned whatever they could find to create fleeting moments of warmth. A group of infantrymen, huddled around a fire made from a farmer's barn, watched the flames consume the wood, knowing it was their only shield against the cold that waited beyond the glow. The retreat from Moscow, ordered as the Red Army's counteroffensive gained momentum, was a descent into chaos. The Germans, who had dreamed of parading through the Kremlin, were now stumbling back through snow and ice, pursued by Soviet ski troops and T-34 tanks that seemed impervious to the winter. The retreat was no orderly withdrawal, but a desperate flight, with units abandoning equipment, supplies, and sometimes even their own wounded to escape the advancing enemy. A machine gunner, struggling through a blizzard, saw his unit leave a wounded comrade behind, the man's cries lost in the wind. "We couldn't carry him," he later told himself, his voice hollow with guilt. The snow-covered roads, once paths to victory, became graveyards for men and machines, littered with frozen bodies and broken tanks. A young officer, leading his men through a snowstorm, counted only half his company still standing, the rest lost to cold, exhaustion, or Soviet gunfire. Frostbite and hypothermia continued to claim lives with ruthless efficiency. The soldiers, exposed to the elements for days at a time, suffered injuries that turned minor wounds into death sentences. A corporal, his toes frozen after hours in a flooded trench, limped to a field hospital only to find it overrun with similar cases. The medic, his hands numb from the cold, shook his head. "We can't save them all," he said, his eyes avoiding the corporal's as he prepared for another amputation. The hospitals, little more than tents or requisitioned buildings, lacked heat, medicine, and hope. Men died quietly, their bodies succumbing to the cold they could no longer fight. By January 1942, frostbite alone had incapacitated tens of thousands of Germans, with some estimates suggesting over 150,000 German soldiers suffered cold-related injuries that winter, many permanently maimed. The Red Army's counterattacks, launched with precision in the heart of the winter, capitalized on the Germans' desperation. Soviet troops, clad in the winter gear the Germans had mocked, moved swiftly through the snow, their skis and padded boots allowing them to outmaneuver their frozen enemies. T-34 tanks designed to operate in extreme cold rolled over German positions, their crews warm in their quilted uniforms. A German sergeant, watching a Soviet assault overrun his outpost, saw the enemy soldiers moving with an ease his own men couldn't muster. "They're not human," he muttered, his rifle useless in his frozen hands. "They're part of this damned winter." The Soviets, emboldened by their advantage, pressed the attack, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing thousands of Germans who were too weak to resist. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. The soldiers, who had once believed in their army's invincibility, now faced a reality where survival was their only goal. The winter had stripped away their pride, their confidence, their sense of purpose. A young private, hiding in a snow-covered ditch as Soviet artillery pounded his position, clutched a stolen Soviet hat, its fur matted with blood. "We laughed at this," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Now it's all we have." The men began to question their leaders, their mission, and even themselves. The propaganda that had fueled their advance, promises of a quick victory, of a superior race, rang hollow in the face of a winter that cared nothing for their ideals. Despair crept in, a cold as deadly as the one outside, sapping their will to fight. The desperation of that winter was a crucible, revealing the cost of the Germans' earlier mockery. The Soviet winter gear, once a source of amusement, had become a symbol of their failure to prepare, a failure that left them exposed to a season they could not outrun or outfight. The retreat, marked by abandoned comrades and burning villages, was a stark reminder of their vulnerability. As they stumbled through the snow, their bodies and spirits broken, the German soldiers faced a truth they could no longer ignore. The Russian winter and the enemy that empowered it was a force they had underestimated at their peril. The catastrophe they had suffered was only the beginning, and the road ahead promised only more hardship, more loss, and more despair.
As the winter of 1941-1942 gave way to the muddy spring, the German soldiers who survived the brutal ordeal on the Eastern Front carried scars that went beyond the frostbite on their hands or the losses in their ranks. The Russian winter, which they had mocked as a minor nuisance, had proven to be a formidable adversary, one that worked in tandem with the Red Army to shatter the Wehrmacht's dreams of a swift victory. The heavy Soviet winter gear, quilted coats, fur hats, padded boots that they had ridiculed as primitive had been their salvation, while the Germans' thin uniforms and overextended supply lines left them vulnerable to a season that cared nothing for their blitzkrieg tactics. Nature, with its freezing temperatures and relentless snowstorms, had joined forces with logistical failures to deliver a blow as devastating as any Soviet offensive. The catastrophe of that winter was not just a setback, but a turning point, one that revealed the limits of German hubris and reshaped the course of the war. The Eastern Front and the lessons it taught about the power of nature and logistics would leave a legacy that echoed through the Wehrmacht's defeat and the future of military strategy. The immediate aftermath was grim. The German army, which had begun Operation Barbarossa with over 3 million men, emerged from the winter battered and broken. The Battle of Moscow, where their advance was halted, marked the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht, with estimates of over 800,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or incapacitated by frostbite and disease by early 1942. The soldiers who survived were shadows of the confident troops who had laughed at Soviet winter gear months earlier. A young infantryman, his feet permanently damaged by frostbite, limped through a muddy camp, his eyes hollow as he recalled the retreat. "We thought we could conquer anything," he said to a comrade, his voice low. "But the snow, it was as much our enemy as the Reds." The winter had claimed not just lives, but the myth of German invincibility, a belief that had fueled their early successes but crumbled under the weight of ice and exhaustion. Nature's role was undeniable. The Soviet winter, with temperatures plunging to -40 degrees Celsius and snowstorms that buried roads in tanks, had been a force the Germans were utterly unprepared to face. Their blitzkrieg strategy, built on speed and mobility, relied on clear weather and firm ground, conditions that vanished in the Russian snow. Tanks froze, their engines choked by sub-zero temperatures, trucks sank into drifts, cutting off vital supplies, and soldiers, clad in inadequate uniforms, succumbed to frostbite and hypothermia at an alarming rate. The Soviet troops, equipped with winter gear designed for these conditions, moved with an ease the Germans couldn't match, their ski units and T-34 tanks exploiting the snow to outmaneuver their frozen foes. The German officer, reflecting on a Soviet ambush that decimated his unit, wrote in his diary, "The winter fights for them. It's as if the land itself wants us gone." The Russian landscape, vast and unforgiving, had become a silent ally of the Red Army, amplifying their resistance and exposing the Germans' fatal overconfidence. Logistical failures were equally decisive. The Wehrmacht supply chain, stretched across thousands of miles, collapsed under the strain of the winter. The German High Command, expecting a quick victory, had failed to stockpile winter clothing, fuel, or food for a prolonged campaign. Supply depots, when they existed, were often hundreds of miles behind the front, inaccessible through snow-choked roads. A supply sergeant, staring at an empty warehouse near Rzhev, shook his head in disbelief. "They told us we'd have coats by December," he said, his voice bitter. "All we got was orders to keep fighting." The soldiers, left to scavenge blankets, Soviet coats, or even civilian clothing, resorted to desperate measures to survive. But these were no substitute for the systematic preparation the Soviets had mastered. The Red Army, with its shorter supply lines and winter-ready equipment, moved with an ease the Germans couldn't match, their ski units and T-34 tanks exploiting the snow to outmaneuver their frozen foes. A German officer, reflecting on a Soviet ambush that decimated his unit, envied the padded boots of his captors. "We laughed at those boots," he admitted to a fellow prisoner, his voice heavy with regret. "Now they're walking over us." The interplay of nature and logistics was as critical as combat strategy in the German defeat. The Red Army's counteroffensives, launched with precision by commanders like Georgy Zhukov, capitalized on the weakened state of the Wehrmacht. Soviet troops, warm in their quilted jackets and fur hats, struck at German lines with devastating effect, their mobility unhampered by the snow that crippled their enemies. The Battle of Moscow, followed by further Soviet pushes in early 1942, forced the Germans into a retreat that cost them men, equipment, and morale. The Soviets' ability to fight in winter, supported by a logistical system that prioritized cold weather gear, turned the season into a weapon. A German corporal, captured during a Soviet assault, envied the padded boots of his captors. "We laughed at those boots," he admitted to a fellow prisoner, his voice heavy with regret. "Now they're walking over us." The legacy of this catastrophe reshaped military thinking. The German High Command, chastened by the winter's toll, began to prioritize logistics and environmental preparation in later campaigns, though too late to salvage their fortunes on the Eastern Front. The failure of 1941 to 1942 became a case study in the dangers of underestimating nature, a lesson that echoed through military academies in the decades that followed. Future armies, from NATO to the Soviet Union, studied the Eastern Front, noting how the Russian winter and logistical failures could break even the most formidable force. The German soldiers' mockery of Soviet winter gear, once a symbol of their arrogance, became a cautionary tale about the need for preparation and respect for the environment. A post-war German general, reflecting on the defeat, wrote, "We fought the Russians, but we lost to the winter. No strategy can succeed without supplies and survival." For the soldiers who endured that winter, the experience was transformative. Those who survived carried physical and mental scars, amputated limbs, haunted memories of comrades left in the snow, and a newfound respect for the land they had underestimated. Some, repatriated as prisoners or returning after the war, spoke of the winter with a mix of awe and dread, their stories shaping Germany's collective memory of the Eastern Front. A former Panzer crewman, speaking to his children years later, described the snow as a white death that swallowed us whole. His words, echoed by thousands of veterans, underscored the winter's role as a turning point, a moment when the Wehrmacht's dreams of conquest were buried under ice and defeat. The broader impact on the war was profound. The failure to take Moscow in 1941 marked the end of Germany's blitzkrieg dominance, shifting the Eastern Front into a war of attrition that favored the Soviets' vast resources and resilience. The winter of 1941 to 1942, amplified by logistical failures, cost the Germans not just men and machines, but the initiative, allowing the Red Army to regroup and counterattack. The Soviet winter gear, once mocked, became a symbol of survival, a testament to the importance of preparation in the face of nature's power. The Germans' defeat was not just a military loss, but a lesson in hubris, one that would haunt them as the war ground on toward their eventual collapse in 1945. The legacy of that winter endures in the annals of military history. It showed that nature and logistics could be as decisive as tanks and rifles, that no army, however skilled, could triumph without respecting the environment it fought in. The German soldiers, who had laughed at the Soviet coats and boots, learned this lesson at a terrible cost, their suffering a reminder that war is not just a clash of strategies, but a battle against the elements themselves. The Eastern Front and the lessons it taught about the power of nature and logistics stand as a testament to the power of nature and the necessity of preparation, a legacy that continues to inform how wars are fought and how armies survive.